think we had 22 killed in the battalion during the year and 70 or 80 wounded. And you never knew when it was going to happen. I mean, sometimes you expected to run into a sizable Viet Cong group and you didn't. And sometimes you weren't expecting anyone to be around and blam, sniper shoots someone. So it was, you had to be constantly on your toes. And I went back about 3 years later just to have a look at things from a historical point of view. And by that stage, the American Army was really being rocked by drugs. But on the whole, we were spared it, I think, partly because we didn't have as much money as the Americans, and therefore the drug pushers focused much more on the Americans, and the Americans were much more numerous, more high profile, and so on. I can remember another one where we were involved in an attack on a Viet Cong position somewhere in the northeast of the province. I think this was probably when I was still B Company second in command, and there was quite a lot of fire flying around. And seeing some of our chaps just get up and charge straight into it, and you felt like saying, "Get out, you fools! You're not bulletproof." And these guys never thought about that. They were aware that someone was firing at them, and particularly when one of their own friends had been wounded, a different sort of reflex takes over, and you're full of adrenaline to go and get that bastard before he kills someone else. In Melbourne in 1936, I went to Scotch College, Melbourne. I went from there to the Royal Military College, Duntroon, not because I necessarily intended to stay in the army for the rest of my life, but I thought it was an interesting thing to do. I graduated from Duntroon in 1958. The army sent me on to Melbourne University to finish off an engineering degree, because that's the only sort of degree they would let you do in those days. And I then got the Rhodes Scholarship from Melbourne to Oxford in 1960. I went to Oxford in 61. I there broadened my education by doing a bachelor's degree in philosophy, politics and economics, which brought me to international relations. And then I stayed on for another 2 years and did a doctorate of philosophy, in which my topic was the relationship between the German army and the Nazi party. Well, then the Vietnam War was going and the army needed me back. So I came back. I was sent to Vietnam with the 5th Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment in April of 1966.
How did you personally get to Vietnam?
I went by aircraft. Company seconds in command usually went a couple of weeks ahead of their company, because they had to see that there were tents erected for them, that there was water supply, that there would be vehicles, and to get the whole thing set up. So I arrived in Vietnam, I think around the middle of April 1966, and went down to Vung Tau, which is where the battalion came in at, and then helped to get things set up, and then the company came in I think around the 26th of April, and we then had a couple of weeks to sort of shake down.
What were your first impressions of arriving at a place like Vung Tau?
Well, smell. It was quite powerful, because we were out in an area which was not far from a rubbish tip, and because it was a fishing area, there was fish waste all over the place. Humidity, heat, and realising that it was going to be like this for the next 12 months, that the climate sort of alternated between wet and dry, but it was hot and humid nearly all the time. Being in a Southeast Asian, essentially village environment, was the next thing to get to grips with, and discover how these little societies of people worked, and how to relate to them if you wanted cooperation from them, how you could do things for them to improve the relationship, and that kind of thing.
When I've interviewed a lot of the Vietnam veterans, they arrived at Vung Tau at a time when it was quite a thriving metropolis. What was there when you arrived there?
Well, we were the first battalion to come into Phuc Tuy, so it had not been shaped by the presence of a big Australian force before. There certainly was some. It was a sizable town. There were a couple of restaurants. There was a run of bars. There were Americans around. They used to use it as a leave centre. But it was, I would say, only marginally developed by comparison with, say, what it would have been in 1968.
And from Vung Tau, where did you proceed to?
Well, we had, as I said, a week or two to shake down in Vung Tau, and then we set off by helicopter to clear the central area of Phuc Tuy, which was to be the task force base, Operation Hardihood, in May of 1966.
Now, you went out by aircraft. How did the rest of the battalion get out there?
By HMAS Sydney.
And how long did they take to catch up with you then?
They took a couple of weeks. I think they probably left Australia a day or two after we left by aircraft from Richmond.
Okay, and so how did you go about preparing then your facilities, your camps? Where did you get the materials from?
A certain amount came from the Americans. As I say, I just assumed that was done by purchase. And some had come through the Australian system, not a lot. The Australian logistics system was only just building up. The first Australian logistics support group was barely established, I think, when we arrived. And for the first 3 or 4 months, not very much came through the pipeline. I can tell you some amusing stories about how we got things from the Americans later on.
Well, you can tell me now if you want.
Okay, well, we arrived at the beginning of the wet season, and once we were established on our base up in central Phuc Tuy, the heavens were opening up every afternoon, and boy, it was like being under Niagara. And all we had to camp under were our Capes half shelter that we carried in our packs on the back, and you joined yours on with another guys to make a full shelter. They were called hutchis. They were about that high off the ground and went down there. There was nothing much to put on the ground other than a piece of plastic, and you would usually wake up in a sort of flowing river of mud if it had been raining at all during the night. And this was leading to health problems and morale problems and so on. So I had a very experienced company quartermaster sergeant, who's my right-hand man, Sailor Mealing. Sailor had been in the Korean War and the Malayan Emergency. A great character. I don't know what happened to him. I hope he's still alive. But anyway, Sailor said to me one day, we ought to go down to the beach and liberate a marquee from the Americans. So I said, do you know how to do it? And he said, yeah. He said, I'll need your authority. So we took the company jeep and trailer and we went off down to Vung Tau. And Sailor was one of these old soldiers who could talk his way in anywhere. And we got into this American base and looked around, and we saw there was a row of 6 marquees all pitched there, of which at least 4 were empty. And Sailor raised his eyebrows and looked at me and said, you see what I see, boss. And he then went off and sweet-talked some Americans into lending him their jackets and caps. And he gave me an American jacket and cap and said, put this on. And he put his on. And we went around, and he took the pegs out and took one of the marquees down, and I helped fold it up, and we got it and its poles all into the company trailer. And then he returned the caps and jackets without explaining what they'd been used for. And we set off through the gate, and we had ourselves a marquee for the company. So our chaps were able to eat their meals in shelter. And there are a few other stories like that to be related of how Australians got by at a time of real dearth of supplies. Quite important things. Lots of things were transferred through the ANZUS alliance without any formalities taking place.
I think it's an Australian soldier's right to borrow things from the Americans. It still happens today, you'll be pleased to know.
Good.
Why do you think the Australian supply line was so weak?
We are very bad at logistics. I mean, our focus in the two world wars and the Korean War had been on providing frontline combat troops, and they'd done that very well, and had been very heavily dependent upon allies for logistics support. I mean, logistics is expensive to do properly, and it consumes a lot of people. We didn't have the sort of force structure to do it properly. Now, as a result of our initial shortcomings in Vietnam, the army and the government, I think, began taking the logistics side more seriously, and things did improve towards the end of our first year. But we were getting by very much on a hand-to-mouth basis, even with basic things like ammunition supply.
That's an important one.
There was, yes.
So you did, around Vung Tau, the battalion initially did some training?
Yes, yes. There is a small range of mountains that overlooks Vung Tau, the Gun Rai Mountains, and we climbed around in there and honed up our jungle skills a bit. And it was very interesting. The top of Nui Gun Rai is crowned by a French gun battery position that must have been built in the 1930s or possibly the 20s to protect Vung Tau from seaward attack. And when you got up there and saw that the French had really made a major effort here 30 or more years ago, it sort of said to you, well, what do you think you can do that's better than what they could do?
So you were conscious of the fact that somebody else had failed trying to do the same thing?
I was very conscious of it, and you saw evidence all over the province, because there were quite a number of French forts that had either been vacated and fallen into disrepair, or some had been taken over by the South Vietnamese army. And of course there was still a French commercial presence in the form of the rubber plantations around Binh Ba and further north, and we can talk more about that later.
What sort of mixture was the battalion of national servicemen and regulars?
50-50, pretty well. It was very hard to tell who was national service and who was regular, apart from the age difference in the case of some of the regulars. The only way to tell really was to look at their regimental number. If the second digit was a 7, they were national servicemen. So it was quite remarkable, the cohesion that the battalion developed. You just didn't feel that it was a divided unit at all.
And amongst those national servicemen, were there some who didn't want to be there? And
Well, I suppose there were, but they didn't. Only one of them ever made that at all apparent by refusing to obey an order, and that was only for a short space of time. It's remarkable. It just was not a problem, and I expected it to be, but no, it wasn't. I mean, I think there's a certain amount in the logic of the combat situation where you're placed in a situation where your lives are all at risk. The best way to get home is to do what you've been taught to do and all support each other.
what about fleeing?
Well, there's nowhere to flee to. You're in a hostile environment. No one was going to desert to the Viet Cong. That was not a good way to have a healthy future.
So amongst those national servicemen, there was no deliberate dragging of the feet or avoidance or unrest generated?
Certainly not in my time.
Tell us how you came to move up north then.
Yeah, well, we got our orders for Operation Hardihood in early May, and we were moved up by an American Iroquois helicopter company. We'd done some shakeout training exercises with them before, so we knew what their procedures were and how to call for more assistance and how to release them so that they were not held in a vulnerable area for longer than was necessary, and so on. And they took us up, and we arrived a bit north of Nui Dat. There's a map in my book which shows exactly where we went, and we did company patrols around the area and gradually converged on the part that was to be the base, having cleared the area around.
And you were, as the company 2IC, what was your role in that situation?
Partly, well, I was the administrative link. You know, when we needed anything sent up, it was my job to get in touch with battalion headquarters and say we need such and such supply of ammunition or medical supplies or rope or whatever it was that we needed. It was also my job to see that everyone was properly fed on the ground, and when we occupied a defensive position at night, it was my job to go around and see that the three separate platoons had coordinated their defences and each could give each other mutual support. And generally to be available to help the company commander, Bruce McWalter, who'd been 1 year ahead of me at Duntroon, whom I knew pretty well, and we had a good personal relationship. Anything else I could do for him?
As the company 2IC, does that mean in the normal schedule of things you would be left out of battle?
Yes. Except on these patrol operations where the company was moving as a whole into a new area, everyone went along. But on quite a number of the earlier company actions, my job was to stay home with, say, about 20 soldiers and man the company base, so that if there was a Viet Cong attack while the company was out, you know, they couldn't just walk in the front door.
Can you describe to me the terrain and the topography up there where you moved?
It was very beautiful for the most part. At times it reminded me of a sort of overgrown English park because of the lushness of the growth, the bright greenness everywhere. You know, it was for me, having been in Europe and gotten used to bright European greens, coming back to Australia for 4 or 5 months and then going back to Vietnam, it kind of seemed like reconnecting with normality to see all this bright greenery again. The terrain of central Phuoc Tuy was fairly flat. There were mountains in the southeast and the southwest, and there were a couple of hills in the central part of the province which were not all that high, but they were important tactically because they gave you viewpoints, and they were not difficult to climb. And of course, we had one at the central part of the task force base, Nui Dat, but there were 3 Nui Dats in Phuoc Tuy, as you may have come to learn by now, so you have to be careful which one you're talking about. The northern part of the province was covered with jungle. The central part was the fertile rice growing area. It was mainly paddies, and then you had a band between the paddy area and the jungle, which was the rubber plantations, and the rubber plantations went further on up Route 2, which ran north-south through the province. And over on the eastern side of the province, you had the district of Suen Mok, which was quite isolated from the rest. Yeah, right. The soil was red, very fine particles, and so it got into everything. And so everything green or khaki acquired this patina of redness, and you just had to accept that as part of your life. Your skin even acquired a reddish tint because of all the red dust that was in the water and in the clothing you wore, and so on. And for 6 months of the year, you had this terrific downpour that took place most afternoons. So you just got used to being wet, which was not uncomfortable because it was not cold for the most part. But of course, if oily clothing is wet a lot of the time, your feet deteriorate, and looking after your feet was a bit of a problem. And there were a lot of skin disorders we're lucky that we had good medical attention. Otherwise, we would not have been able to stand the distance.
What about the locals? Did you have much to do with them, or what were your impressions of them during that period?
Once I became intelligence officer, I had quite a lot to do with the locals, because I very soon worked out that what came down the chain of command by way of intelligence to me was often a week, fortnight old. The best way to find out what the Viet Cong were up to in the province was to go out and talk to Vietnamese who lived out in the various districts. And so there were, I think, 6 districts in Phuoc Tuy. Sun Mok was one, Dat Do in the central area was another, Duc Mi in the north, Duc Tan. Where was it? I've forgotten which. It was Duc Tan in the north, and I've just forgotten the name of the district in the east. In the west. Anyway, each of those was run by a South Vietnamese captain. In a couple of them there was an American advisor. They had the problem of survival in an environment where they could be easily overrun, because if the Viet Cong concentrated their forces, they could produce a whole regiment like 274 or 275. And so these chaps needed good intelligence, and in some cases they did their own trade-offs with the Viet Cong to buy protection for themselves. Not all of them did. Anyway, by establishing a network like that, I was able to find out what was going on in the immediate vicinity, and then coming down from higher up we had the benefit of signals, traffic intercepts. We weren't told very much about that, but every now and then someone would come down from the task force headquarters and say, "Oh, we have very reliable information that so and so and so and so," and then you'd know where it had come from. And then the third source of intelligence I had was establishing personal contacts with the Americans. I had a commanding officer who was very liberal, gave me a lot of latitude in operating, and having got to know Americans a lot at Oxford and knowing how much they like to talk and how they're interested in foreigners themselves, I decided I would go to the American Corps headquarters up at Long Bin. I just got an army helicopter, one of our little army helicopters, to fly me up there. And I just turned up at this place that was commanded by a lieutenant general and hundreds of colonels and so on, and walked in the door and said, "I'm the intelligence officer from 5th Battalion in the Australian Task Force. I'm here to talk to your intelligence staff." And this sort of threw them. They said, "Oh, sure, you're down the corridor in there." So I got to meet people personally, and while the Americans normally have a very fixed and formal chain of command, I fell outside of that because I was Australian, and they would tell me all kinds of things face to face that would take a couple of weeks to reach me through the chain of command. So I was able to do this and then report back to the task force headquarters on things that I found out that they needed to know about, as well as let the battalion know. So I had intelligence going at those 3 levels. But coming back to the local people, the key thing we knew about what would determine the success or failure of our operation is whether the local people liked us, basically, that it was a war for their affections, and we were there to help them and not to make life difficult for them, not to take big chunks of territory off them and declare them free fire zones, definitely not to drive tanks across their rice fields as the Americans would do time after time. There's a story I often used to tell my students at Oxford, the difference between the American approach to counterinsurgency and the Australian approach, and I've seen it with my own eyes in Vietnam. American cavalry unit chasing some Viet Cong on foot, the Viet Cong would run for a village. They'd run along some paddy field bunds, and the Americans chasing them with armoured personnel carriers would go straight through the rice field, destroying the means of sustenance of that village, you know, for months.
And probably creating more Viet Cong.
Exactly. Australians, exactly the same project, would do it on foot, and they would run around the paddy bunds too, and then try and talk their way into the village. And you know, that had some, didn't always work, but it had some chance of working, whereas the Americans were making enemies by the hundreds.
So when you arrived in Nui Dat, there was an assessment made that some of the locals had to be pushed back, or
yes.
Can you talk about that?
I can't tell you much about it because that happened above my level, and it was a couple of villages of people. One was Long Tan village, and I think the other was Long Phuc. They were displaced and put somewhere else, and the 6th Battalion did that. And if you talk to people from 6 Hour, they can. I knew it was going on, but we weren't involved. We were operating more on the north side, where our task was not to displace people, but to try and get some relationship going, so that we knew what the Viet Cong were up to in the northern part of the province. So, after establishing ourselves, the sort of first major operations we did were to try and get a handle on the Viet Cong presence in the village of Duc My, which was the first one up Route 2 north of the task force, which is mainly a montagnard village. They were people who had been refugees during the French War, and they'd been resettled, and they tended to be isolated. And there certainly was some Viet Cong penetration, but they were not enthusiastic of the Viet Cong at all. They just wanted help, and they were easy to fix. The next village up was much bigger, Bin Ba, which had a population of somewhere between 1 and 2,000. It was a French rubber plantation village. Everyone lived in little brick cottages laid out on a formal grid pattern, totally different to what you would expect for a South Vietnamese village. There was a lovely big airstrip in the middle of the rubber plantation. The plantation managers lived in lovely big 1930s style houses with white plastered walls outside, and they had it good. But of course that village, because it was the centre of economic activity in the northern part of the province, attracted a lot of Viet Cong influence, and they particularly used to come and tax people and collect rice and other things that they needed. And the French rubber plantation used to pay tax to the Viet Cong. Exactly how they did it I never found out, whether it was locally done or whether it was done on an international basis from their headquarters in Paris. Goodness only knows, but they certainly had protection. And we had to treat the French in a special category. They obviously were not enemy, and we didn't want to treat them as enemy. At the same time, although they were sort of fellow Westerners in a Southeast Asian environment, we didn't want to embrace them too much, because that would be the end of them. I think the Viet Cong would cut their throats, as they did later on in 1968 after the Tet offensive, but they didn't, at least while we were there. But it was useful to have a degree of rapport with them. We never used them as part of our intelligence linkage, but it was good to have a friendly relationship with them so that we could continue to work through the people of Bin Ba who did provide useful intelligence. I had 3 Vietnamese English literature students from the University of Saigon as interpreters with me. I mean, I didn't speak Vietnamese. I could speak a few words of it.
This is when you were an intelligence officer?
Yes, yeah. And I used to always take one of them with me. And they were particularly, I mean, they were very intelligent, and they could not only interpret for me in a linguistic sense, but they could interpret for me in a social sense. And they could tell me what to do, how to conduct myself, how to sit, what sort of gestures to avoid, and so on. And they could also give me a fair idea of what the mood of the place was that I was.
You must have trusted them completely.
Yeah, I did. And I realised there was a risk in that, but I used to always make sure they came with me on operations, so that if I got it, they got it.
Talking about your first combat, just taking you back, were you at all worried that the Australian Army was going to match up to the North Vietnamese?
Yes, of course. There we were with a battalion that had recently come together. Half of them were motor mechanics, barbers, taxi drivers from around Sydney, going to war with this lot against people who'd been defending their native soil for 30 years and done it rather well. Yeah, it was scary. However, after our first couple of contacts with the Viet Cong, I could see that our guys could really hack it. I mean, they had learnt a certain amount about tactics, and they were good at seeing where the enemy were. They were accurate shots. In a firefight, they could hold their own, and it was a sort of remarkable confirmation of the effectiveness of the training system, and of how adaptable the average Australian is to this sort of situation.
And there was a fatality on one of your combats. Was that
Oh yes, the first one.
Yeah.
This was Private Errol Noack, who was the first national serviceman killed in Vietnam, and this happened. I think it was on the first day of Operation Hardihood. We got B Company. Noack was in B Company. Got rather close to A Company, I think, in our patrols, and there was a small Viet Cong group somewhere around, and in the process of a skirmish, Noack stood up and someone shot him. It was probably someone in A Company mistaking him, but I don't know the details of it to that extent. My feeling at the time was that he'd probably been shot by the Viet Cong, but I didn't know at that point how close the A Company element had been, and he died on his way back to hospital. I think he had a bullet in his liver.
Were you in charge of evacuating casualties? Was that one of your roles?
Yes. Yeah.
Can you talk about how you handled that? I mean, it wasn't part of your life at Oxford, or
No.
It must have been quite harrowing.
Yes, it was. Well, there was a company medic, and his job was to put the first dressings on and try and make some specialised assessment of what actually needed to be done. My role was more in terms of being able to get hold of the people who had the helicopters and have one sent forward to an area where it could reach us fairly quickly if we needed it, and then guide them in, make sure that there was an adequate sized landing area for the helicopter, that it was secure, that the pilot could see the H on the ground and know where to put down, and that sort of thing, and also to try and give a bit of psychological comfort by talking to whoever was being evacuated, if they were capable of talking. But that's really what it involved.
Was there many casualties in those first few combats?
No, not many. There were a few woundings. Noack was the only death that I recall in Operation Hardihood. But there were quite a number of others. I think we had 22 killed in the battalion during the year and 70 or 80 wounded. And you never knew when it was going to happen. I mean, sometimes you expected to run into a sizable Viet Cong group and you didn't. And sometimes you weren't expecting anyone to be around and blam, sniper shoots someone. So you had to be constantly on your toes for it. And our battalion doctor, Tony White, really was particularly good. I don't know if you're interviewing him.
Not personally.
No,
Yeah.
no. I made a when your people contacted me, I made a recommendation that Tony should be interviewed. He's a skin specialist, and his surgery is probably no more than a couple of k's away from where we're sitting now. They live in Randwick, and if you read my book, you'll see what a brave guy he was in terms of going right into combat situations where they were wounded, so that he could get to them and treat them quickly.
Did you have time to pause and think like where you'd ended up as a
Yes,
you're
I
working
did.
for
I
the
did.
infantry, you're on the front line there, and really you're an sort of academic and intellectual man.
Yeah.
How was that juxtaposition working at that time for you?
Yeah, well, it was not always a happy juxtaposition. One of the reasons I began writing the book was that when you're out on operations, I didn't have a huge amount to do as intelligence officer. My main work was done when we were back in base, sort of using my network, finding out what was happening, advising the commanding officer on what I thought the Viet Cong would be doing in the face of the next operation. And so when we were out in the field, my job mainly was being a spare command post officer, and I used to take my turn on the command net for 3 hours every night, and sometimes during the day. So I had a bit of time spare, and I wanted to get a book out of the war. So I said to the colonel, how about I write a history of our operations while we're going along. Would you approve and would you cooperate? And he said yes to both of those. I later on had problems with the army in getting it published, but that's another story. Anyway, so when we were out on operations, I was usually able to take a bit of time and sit under a tree somewhere and just write my thoughts on what we were going through and why we were doing it and all this sort of thing. We had an excellent postal service. That really was one of the features of this war. I used to carry a little green covered plastic notebook in my pocket because that protected it from the rain. I had small loose leaf pages, and I would write several of these and pop them in an envelope and send them to Sally. She would read it, type them up, do a bit of editing because she's very good at that. And she would then send a copy of the typescript back to me, and then I'd go through it and make a few editorials, and I'd send that back to her. So by the time I got through 12 months in Vietnam, I had this book pretty well written. So that was one way of coming to terms with it. But the more I served in Vietnam, the more I could feel that this is okay to do once, but definitely not again. It wasn't, it was mentally testing to a certain extent, but you could see that it was going to run out of fascination sometime soon. And the whole business of soldiering, is pretty physical, pretty basic, and so on. And again, interesting thing to do once. But so I realised after I'd been there for a few months that I had to think my way out of the army, and it got me down a bit. And I can remember an operation we did in, I think it was November of 1966 on Long Son Island. It was an operation that went fairly well. Not a lot happened at battalion headquarters, and I had a lot of time to myself. And I really disliked what I was doing. I was not happy. So I then decided I definitely would leave the army as soon as I could after we got back to Australia.
What did you dislike so much? What was getting to you?
I suppose, just being told to do things all the time, not being able to take a lot of personal initiative, and partly feeling that I was getting a bum rap, that we all were, that we were in this war situation, not defending a really vital national interest. It was different from the First and Second World Wars in that sense, and coming increasingly to think maybe our government hasn't made a very wise choice in all this, and we're being the bunnies for the sake of some kind of national insurance policy, and that was not a terribly appealing thought.
National insurance policy against the
against the communists.
communists,
That's the old argument that John Howard uses for being in Iraq, to maintain the ANZUS alliance. Well, I thought, okay, if they want to do that, they can do it with someone else. Do it once, not again. So that raised the problem of what to do next, and then actually how to do it. And not long afterwards, the chap who was the director of academic studies at Duntroon wrote to me saying that Duntroon is going to become part of the University of New South Wales. We're going to set up this Faculty of Military Studies. We're going to upgrade the academic side of the work, and would you be interested in coming back and joining the history department as a senior lecturer? And that was just the right time to ask me that question, and so I said yes. And the long and the short of that was that I knew my next job would be a quasi-academic one at Duntroon, and I could probably then continue to move sideways out of the army into a civilian capacity at Duntroon, and then move on into the wider academic world, and that's really what happened. So I became more adjusted to my fate, I suppose, by the end of 1966. But for a while there, I was not a very happy camper.
You mentioned that you were thinking your way out of the army. Was the fact that you could see people getting killed around you, that the civilian population was getting killed, was that an issue for you as well, or was it more the political reasons that you didn't believe were right that you were there?
It was much more the political and strategic issue. I mean, people being killed around you, particularly when they're your own kind, wearing your own uniform. I mean, that has a pretty reinforcing impact. You want to help, you want to stop this from, just want to stop other people from dying, and so on. That didn't sort of undermine my commitment, but it was more the feeling that people in Canberra really just did not understand this, and the feeling of, or the knowledge of serving alongside the Americans, seeing how ineffective their huge resources were. When our battalion first came to Vietnam, a couple of the officers, Max Carroll, who was the Battalion Operations Officer, and a couple of others, were seconded to the American 174th Airborne Brigade, and they did a couple of operations with them. And the stories they brought back were quite frightening. The Americans not knowing anything about jungle tactics, and instead of creeping around finding out what's going on silently and not betraying your presence to the enemy, they would come in helicopter loads by the dozen, and they would advance a certain way into the jungle, and every now and then they would conduct what they called recon by fire. They would set up machine guns and they would fire hundreds of rounds forward of them into the jungle just to sort of see what was there. Well,
and you were witness to this as well?
I wasn't, but Max Carroll certainly was, and others. And we heard these sorts of stories, and you heard about the lack of training of a lot of American infantrymen, people smoking on patrol, sort of giving their presence away to anyone with a sense of smell, and so on. I mean, there were some operations that the Americans were very good at, like kicking the Viet Cong headquarters out of Tay Ninh province and across the border into Cambodia. You needed hundreds of armoured personnel carriers and helicopters for that, and they did it. But counterinsurgency, they were not making much of an impact on. They didn't understand it. Westmoreland didn't have any feel for it. He tried to keep the South Vietnamese and American armies as far apart as possible. He accepted no responsibility for command over the South Vietnamese forces, and the South Vietnamese forces tended to sort of crawl into their shell and feel demoralised and feel we're not wanted anyway, so we won't do anything. And the result was, increasingly, you had the war being conducted by a high firepower-oriented American military who really understood very little about the social structure of the country they were trying to assist. And so seeing all that going on, we developed our own style of operation in contradistinction to that. And one of the purposes of this book was a little subversion, which I had to be very careful about, because I was still in the army. That chapter there, A Re-evaluation of Strategy, was looking at our earlier operational experience, which had partly been in conventional operations and partly in specialised counterinsurgency, which involved cordoning villages off, getting to know people in them, and then applying programs of civil aid that would be help to them, and evaluating the success of each kind. And you know, we came down very heavily on the side of a special lightweight counterinsurgency approach.
Lightweight?
Yes. You don't make much of a military impact on the soil, and you don't need heavy military equipment to do it for the most part. And this gave me more of an insight into why the Americans were getting it wrong. And I also thought some parts of the Australian Army were getting it wrong too. But our own battalion developed its own particular operational style, which is really what that book is all about.
What are the hallmarks of that style?
Trying to develop as friendly a relation and supportive a relationship as you can with the local people, minimising the harm, the economic disruption, the personal disruption that you cause them, trying to keep the Viet Cong well away so that they don't bring much pressure to bear on the local people, and eventually starve the Viet Cong of information and supplies through interdiction of the area between the central populated part and the Viet Cong out into the jungle. In other words, you did not need to take the war out there to the Viet Cong and get involved in big battles, which is what the Americans were doing all the time. And the Viet Cong were very good at this, what I call the strategy of the lure. You know, if you've ever been fishing, you know, you drop something in the water and it looks interesting to a fish, and along he comes and investigates it, and then you hook him. Well, the Americans were being hooked by the Viet Cong. They would create some small incident. They would come and raid a small village or a police post or a small army outpost somewhere, and they'd back off. And of course the Americans would come charging out with full might, and you know, before they got there they would be ambushed, or they would find themselves in a minefield or with booby traps going off around them all the time. And they were losing a high rate of casualties, 55,000 killed. That's big losses in this war. You could tell that American society could not support that all that long. The Americans did see the error, or some of them saw the error of their ways in the late 60s. The guy who replaced Westmoreland, General Creighton Abrams, was much more alive to the nature of the war, but you know, he was taking over a situation that was 5 years old, where a lot of damage had been done, with a military that really didn't want to be re-educated. I mean, the American military is still pretty much heavy firepower, hard driving stuff, and where they can't do that effectively, they'll do it ineffectively.
Can you tell us then, give us specific examples of how that you tried to apply that re-evaluation strategy from your own personal experience?
Yeah.
And then how you tried to transfer that knowledge to the Americans?
Well, we didn't try and transfer it to the Americans. There was no point in that. They didn't want to learn. Some of them looked down on us. We had the occasional semi-hostile article in American press about how we pussyfooted around the jungle and didn't get involved in the serious war kind of thing. So you had that attitude working against you. And Americans don't learn from Australians on the whole. You can at an individual level, but nation to nation we are irrelevant. You know, they do their own thing until they run into big trouble, and then they learn from that. They don't learn from us.
Can you give us a personal example of coming up against, maybe trying to having a conversation and impart what you knew to an American?
After we'd been in Phuoc Tuy for about 6 months, a big American contingent, the 11th Armoured Cavalry, came into the next province, Long Khan, which had not had any Allied force in before. This had been brought straight from West Germany. It had hundreds of helicopters, hundreds of tanks, armoured personnel carriers. It really was hell on wheels, to pinch the motto of another American division. But I went up there to establish contact with their intelligence officer not long after they arrived, and I could see all this stuff sitting there, and every time they moved, clouds of dust went up, and the noise, and the money it cost, and so on. So I said to my American counterpart, "What do you think you're going to do with all this stuff? This is not a high firepower war. This is a war about what the people in the villages who work the rice fields think about the government in Saigon. How does this relate to that?" And he kind of looked at me in amazement and said, "We're here to apply our doctrines of mobile firepower, and if the Viet Cong put their heads up, we'll blast them off." Well, the Viet Cong was smart enough not to do that by and large. Every now and then they did. And this huge outfit, God knows how many hundreds of thousands of dollars a day it cost to operate, did the odd, very successful operation. It played a big part in Operation Junction City, the clearing out of the Viet Cong headquarters from Tay Ninh province. But for the most part, it created trouble and got itself into trouble, or was irrelevant at the best of times. But they just didn't think we were serious, and so you didn't push it too hard.
You just thought this is too hard.
Yeah.
Give up. So what about your own personal re-evaluation strategy? How did you personally apply that in the field?
It was really up to the commanding officer and his senior operations people. But John Waugh was a very unusual commanding officer. About every week he would say to me, "Bob, why are we here? Why do you think we're here?" And I would talk to you about the sorts of things I've been talking in the past 5 minutes, and he would say, "Well, do you think we're achieving that? What about kicking the people out of their banana plantation somewhere else has happened a week or so ago? Do you think that's helping?" And there was plus and minus to talk about and all those sorts of things. But he constantly kept us thinking about bigger issues. And when we got back from the operations on Long Son Island, we had a bit of a lull in operations. And he said to me, he wanted a really thorough evaluation of the effectiveness of our operations over the past 6 months done. So I got to work and I wrote a paper. Goodness knows whether it still avails, but the essence of that paper is Chapter 13 of Vietnam Task. And, we talked about it on battalion headquarters, the colonel, the adjutant Peter Isaacs, the operations officer, which had by then become Peter Cole. Max Carroll had swapped with Peter so that Max could go off and command a company. And we established a fair consensus that what we should be doing was more specialised counterinsurgency operations with very light application force, concentrating on getting the Viet Cong cadres, their clandestine infrastructure out of the populated areas, and then keeping them separated by a policy of interdiction. And that's basically what we did for the next few months.
So what kind of intelligence had you been gathering to be able to come to those conclusions? What conversations were you having with the locals, etc., for you to actually realise that this is the best way forward?
You'd get to talk to them about what they thought about our presence, and some of them would be pretty frank with you, and so they really didn't want you there, or they thought we could do some useful things for them, but they definitely did not want us going around the place creating mayhem and getting innocent people killed and so on, as happened from time to time. And they could all. There was not a lot of support for Viet Cong per se in the district, although there were quite a lot of people who had given them support, and that's because, on balance, they thought the Saigon government was useless or ineffective or corrupt. And it was for much of the time. And they were, if they thought you could offer or help them towards some credible alternative, that was good. They were willing to help, and they were positive and so on. But you had to work within that constraint all the time, and it was an easy constraint for me to see because I was spending a lot of time going around villages, talking to people. There were Catholic priests in several of the villages, and they were easy to develop relations with, partly because they were personally friendly. Some of them spoke English, and they definitely were anti-communist. And other people you got to talk to, were just ordinary farmers or people who had some responsibility in a village, and you didn't always know whether they were telling you the truth. You had to take some judgments there, and probably I got some things wrong. But by and large, you got the feeling that there was a useful role that we could play that would help them, that would be sustainable, but it had to be applied in the spirit of a long-term partnership. So I could also see that if this war was going to be turned around and fought successfully, it was going to have to be a very long-term commitment. And of course, I come back to Australia in early '67, and the political scene was very different to early '66. There's much more public opposition, and of course, it builds and builds. So I could see that my idea of how to conduct war in Vietnam was just not remotely possible, which again led me to feel that I really didn't want to get back into that kind of thing.
Well, while during your year in Vietnam, was your sort of stance towards communism changing? I mean, and versus American democracy, because you saw it in action.
Yeah.
Did you reevaluate that while you were there, or?
Big questions like that, I think, no. I mean, I saw enough of the negative side of communist control within the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese forces against us, not to feel that there was anything attractive in that. I mean, you got to understand why people supported communists, because they needed some alternative to corruption, exploitation, or just non-government, which is what they had to a large extent from Saigon. But it didn't affect how I thought about the bigger Cold War so much, other than that it made me increasingly worried about whether the Americans knew enough about the world to be able to hold their own in the Cold War. But time had moved on a good deal from the 50s. China was going through the Cultural Revolution. There was a clear split between China and Russia. We were not dealing with the possibility of an alliance between the two, as seemed likely in the 50s. The situation in Europe was more stable than it had been in the 1950s. So, you know, I had a sort of basic feeling that, you know, the Cold War would somehow work out. I mean, I had no idea when and how. I wouldn't pretend to have had that now. But as far as America and the Vietnam War was concerned, inside me, I felt this was all headed downhill. And
what sort of success in the intelligence role did you have with getting VC defectors to come across?
Very modest. I mean, there were a few defectors, but not a lot. And whether it had any, whether any credit was due to me or people I was working with is hard to tell, because quite often the decisions of defectors were taken months ahead of when they actually defected. You know, they were looking for an opportunity, and it was not easy to break away. But it certainly was a conscious element of our policy. We were not wanting to appear implacably opposed to them, that there was no way out, and you know, certainly a lot of literature was distributed around the place where they would pick it up. And you know, there are a couple of episodes I relate in the book about returnees. They happened, but not in large quantities.
Can you give me one of those episodes with a returnee?
Yeah. Well, we had one guy. I mean, he had decided quite some time ahead to defect, and we just happened to be the people that he could come across to, because we were operating in his area. And I got to talk to him for an hour or so before he got on a helicopter and went back to Bahria, and was able to ask him why he became a Viet Cong, you know, what he thought of it, how his thoughts had changed, why he had wanted to leave, and so on. And you know, that night he was back in Bahria in an army mess, sitting in an armchair with a beer, watching television. You know, it was as quick and as painless as that. And of course, the Viet Cong returnees were extremely valuable to talk to, because they understood their operational technique and could instruct us in it. And they're also pretty capable. I can remember one operation where we were building a large barbed wire fence around a village to cut off the flow of supplies and intelligence to the Viet Cong. And there was a company of Australian Infantry, there was a company of what we called the Rev Devers. These were the sort of gilded youth of Saigon that were recruited to become members of the Revolutionary Development Corps, and they were kind of like a Vietnamese Peace Corps who were to be sent out and carry democracy and prosperity and so on. And they were a pretty useless bunch who rode around on motorcycles and carried guitars and had lovely girlfriends and so on. We had a company of local Vietnamese troops, and we had a company of Hoi Chan returnees, and we built a section of the fence, and we got each of these other companies to have a go at getting through. Well, the Rev Devers, you know, sort of looked at it and said, "Oh, nasty, spiky stuff," and by and large stayed on this side of it. The South Vietnamese troops made a reasonable effort at getting under or over it, and the former VC, they just went straight through it. You know, it was an amazing comparison of effectiveness.
How did they go so easily through it?
Partly because they were well trained in working together and lifting a small part of the fence. A couple get under, lift the next part. The guys behind then come through, and they work together. They also weren't terribly worried about getting scratched by barbed wire. You know, they had a real sense of mission as well as the technique.
And what perspective did that put into the fixed fortifications that you were building and the Americans were relying on?
Well, we weren't building a lot of fixed fortifications apart from our own base, and we knew enough about the liability that protecting it was, because we had to devote really half the manpower of the task force to securing the base the whole time. The idea of having a 2-battalion task force really was very inefficient. If you had 3 battalions, 2 could be out on operations. It would double your operational capacity. And so, okay, the South Vietnamese forces in their little posts had to have some protection around them, but that really didn't help you much towards winning the war. You had to get out amongst the people and help them.
That seemed to be the basis of your strategy then, to win the people's hearts and minds. The old phrase.
Well, that's a real cliche. Yes,
I know.
So I don't use it.
Which is why I raise my eyebrows when I say it.
Yes.
Let me put it another way. You've described the sort of rather hapless tactical approach of the Americans in the way that they tried to apply their firepower and mobility. At a tactical level, while they were patrolling, the way that they were approaching things, what were your Australian infantry doing? What lessons had they learnt and how did they apply them?
Well, we learnt to keep a low profile, keep our forces fairly well spread out, to move quietly, to not betray our presence very often by use of radio transmission, because that did involve a certain amount of speech that would be audible 20 yards away. Try and reduce dependence upon helicopter support as much as possible. Carry what you needed with you for a couple of days in operations. Set out sentries well out when you stop for a break or an overnight camp.
And what sort of fire discipline were you under compared to the American recon by fire? Yeah,
well, we didn't fire until you were sure of a kill. If a Viet Cong sniper fired at you and slipped away, well, you didn't plaster the jungle with machine gun. You probably didn't fire at all. You might get one shot off. And if you're in a defensive position and expecting a Viet Cong attack, you didn't open fire when the first probes came in and give away your position. You would wait till they got in really close and then give them a good blast. But that happened very rarely. And you didn't saturate the jungle with artillery fire before you went in on operations. Again, this was a frequent American technique to clear resistance out of the way, to blow up booby traps and so on. Sometimes it had some useful side effects, but usually it was much more negative than positive.
It's been going on since the Somme, really, hasn't it? Hoping that your artillery will clear things for you.
That's right.
How often did you yourself get out into the jungle on patrol?
I didn't take patrols out a lot, but every now and then Colonel Waugh would say to me, would I take a little reconnaissance group out and check out something or other? And so, several times I would set out with a group of 3 or 4 others from battalion headquarters, or on one occasion, while I was still 2IC of B Company, I led a joint patrol of all the company seconds in command out, because we had to work out how to site the administrative support in an operation. So I did a bit. I did enough, to have some stories to tell and be thoroughly scared by the whole business, but not enough to actually get wounded.
When you are out doing that sort of patrol or reconnaissance, what sort of mental stress is involved in walking through the jungle?
It's fairly intense because you've got every sense strained to try and pick up some indication of an enemy presence before you get shot, and the strain on the forward scout in a patrol is is really quite immense, and you've got to rotate them every 20 or 30 minutes. Otherwise, the pressure just becomes too much, or they don't do it properly. But once you've got used to it, when all your senses are straining, but you feel this is something I've done before, it doesn't faze you. But it just is very tiring intellectually as well as mentally, and you heave a sigh of relief when you get back into the safety of your own perimeter.
Did you in particular take any measures to make yourself unidentifiable as an officer?
Yes, we did not wear badges of rank. We were careful not to carry any paperwork with us. The big giveaway was proximity to a radio set. You couldn't. Officers did not carry radios as a general thing, so that they were freer for command purposes. And of course, the radio again was attracted attention of a sniper, and SIGs were often shot at, and a few were killed. But they would pick your proximity to the radio and work out, that's the guy running it, he's the one to go after. When, for example, Michael Deek, who was commander of our anti-tank platoon, was involved in a big scrap with the Viet Cong up on a mountain called Nui Dat. As soon as the Viet Cong worked out that he was the guy shouting the orders to the various infantry sections around, they would direct waves of fire in on him and shut him up.
And did you carry the standard SLR rifle when you were outside?
No, I carried an Owen gun.
Well, there's a blast from the past.
Yes, yeah. But that was true of a lot of battalion headquarters personnel, and I think company commanders and company 2ICs. I think most people who were not actually in infantry platoons where you needed the higher firepower, we carried an Owen gun essentially as a personal defensive weapon. And if it had ever come to the point where we had to use it, things would have been really grim.
But carrying a submachine gun, did that not itself identify you as an officer or a commander of some sort?
I suppose it did, but if they were that observant, they probably had you in your sights anyway.
You mentioned the stress of roles like forward scouting and so on. In the months, how did you notice that stress build up amongst the men? Any incidents in particular?
Well, people did get tired, and they needed time back in base to relax, and sometimes they didn't get a lot of time. One of the disadvantages of working with helicopter support is that you can be flown back into action very quickly once you've been taken out of it. And if you look at the number of days on operational patrols that our guys put in the course of a year, as against the number of days that someone was in the front line in the First World War or the Second World War, I think the comparison comes out pretty high on the side of the Vietnam forces. So yeah, strain was a problem. Some people didn't handle it too well when they got back in base. They would drink a huge amount and carry on in a wild fashion, or when they got a few days down at Vung Tau, they would go berserk and have punch-ups with the locals. There was one occasion where a Vietnamese stall of some kind was set alight on the beach in Vung Tau. Drunken soldiery horseplay, really. And all that sort of thing undercut the effectiveness of our civil relations program. So they were. I mean, alcohol was a problem. There were guys, who would drink 20 cans a day when they were back in base, and I know Tony White, our doctor, had to deal with quite a lot of severe alcohol cases.
And venereal disease.
Yeah, well, there was plenty of that. I think Tony told me that we're a battalion of 800, so I think he treated 900 odd cases of VD, and that was because several guys were multiple catchers. It wasn't the whole battalion by any means. I mean, there was a fairly sharp differentiation between guys who used prostitutes and guys who didn't. And, marriage was often a big factor in that. It wasn't always, but...
What about the relationship between officers and men in your battalion?
Yeah.
Any antipathy?
It's hard to think of it, but, I only saw it from the officers' side, so there probably were antipathies on the side of senior NCOs who would think officers were a bunch of jumped up Johnny-come-latelys who didn't understand as much about the trade of soldiery as they did, and probably there were times when your ordinary infantryman would feel, the boss has lost the plot, or he doesn't know what he's asking us to do, etc. I would think all those tensions were there normally, but they didn't boil up in any way that presented a problem in terms of relations. We were a fairly informal lot. People rarely called me sir, for example. They'd usually call me skipper or boss or something. We didn't have first name relationships up the chain of command, and I was careful not to use first name as a normal mode of address down the chain of command unless I knew the person particularly well. And I think Colonel Waugh played a big role in keeping the battalion happy. I think he had served in the army as a private before he went to Duntroon during the Second World War. He had a very nice, easy way of relating to people, and if he saw an officer being a bit offhand towards one of his troops, you felt the weight of the colonel's displeasure.
Was there any antipathy between the Nashos and the regulars?
I don't think so, but I was not at an interface where I was likely to see it, but I certainly wasn't aware of it as a Company 2IC, nor as Battalion IO. You could probably get a more informed answer on that from someone who was a platoon commander. But my gut feeling is that there weren't tensions, that we were all part of a team, we all wanted to get home in one piece, and we'd all help each other to do so.
How did you deal with the stress?
Well, writing the book was one way. Working out my own future was another. Regular exchange of letters with Sally was a third. Having a good personal relationship with John Waugh and Max Carroll and Peter Isaacs on battalion headquarters was another, and Tony White, medical officer. There were a lot of fine, intelligent people, and you could share your problems with them. But there was a certain amount that you just couldn't help, and no one liked being there. We all looked forward tremendously to going home. We could all tell you the number of days to go, and so on. And we were all very glad to get home. And I should think only a tiny proportion ever wanted to go back. But also you were busy. Time went by because there were always things to be done. And for those of us on battalion headquarters, there was the battalion command net to be manned 24 hours a day. And at night you didn't ask the colonel to do it, you didn't ask the battalion second in command to do it. The three people who did it were the adjutant, the signals officer and myself. So that was 3 or 4 hours out of every night. You were always tired because you were never getting more than about 5 hours sleep a night.
And what sort of level of discomfort were you living in on a regular basis?
Yeah, pretty extreme, I suppose. I mean, when you're out on operations, you were sleeping on the ground on a piece of plastic, sometimes under a shelter cape, sometimes not. And we were out on operations about a good half the time, I suppose. You were eating canned rations, and they were pretty monotonous. You learned to take along a packet of curry powder to put in your bully beef and heat it up on a little hexamine stove and so on. I drank a lot of tea because there was plenty of tea, and it was a good way of keeping the body fluids up. The water was pretty terrible because it was always warm and was mainly chlorinated. The worst thing, I suppose, was trying to sleep in those circumstances. And of course, you slept fully clothed with your boots on when you're out on operations. And so back in the base, I slept on a reasonably comfortable stretcher. And after the first 4 or 5 months, I had a tent with floorboards, and that improved things. But there were always lots of other things to deal with. Like the latrines or showering out of a shower bag. You had 2 gallons of water, and that was it.
What sort of health issues were you dealing with?
Skin was the big one, I suppose. And then muscle strains. People would do things that were really beyond their their capacity. I came back with a few afflictions as a result of trying to lift heavy timber beams that were too much for me. That you try and do it when you're constructing a bunker or something like that. It's got to be done, and there's no mechanical equipment to help you with, or you fall into a weapon pit at night because you're not aware it's there, and so on. So you've got all those sorts of things.
What sort of skin situations were you dealing with?
Where you had any tightness, particularly where your belt went, or where your pack straps went, I mean, those patches of your skin tended to become red and prickly. And if some dirt got into a pore, that could quickly become infected and turn very nasty. Some guys got ulcerated sores, particularly on their legs. Exposure to the sun was another problem that you had to think about. Most of us avoided that through. If you had to be out in the open, you'd keep your shirt sleeves down and your hat on and so on. Foot problems. I suffered from vertigo at once towards the end of the time, and that's virally transmitted, I believe.
And speaking of that, what about malaria? Malaria
was around, and we all constantly took Platoon. And the Americans didn't have Platoon. You could bargain all kinds of things for Platoon off the Yanks. So we did that. Encephalitis was another thing that was around. And that's actually what led to our first Battalion Intelligence Officer being taken to Task Force headquarters because one of the task force intelligence people got encephalitis, and that was a frightening thing because it takes away the effectiveness of the brain. That was something I found very scary, but it didn't happen to many people.
What about gastric conditions?
Yeah, they were there in plenty, and you just got used to having a case of the runs. We all had it from time to time.
Did you wear underwear?
Yes, I did. Yeah, I didn't wear a singlet much, but certainly wore underpants. I mean, some guys didn't and felt comfortable that way. I tried it and I didn't feel comfortable. It was nice to be able to put on something clean every couple of days. I always used to carry a spare pair of undies in the pack.
You mentioned that some people really hooked into the alcohol when they were back. Did you personally see any evidence of other substance abuse?
No, we didn't have that problem to any visible extent. I mean, I wouldn't be at all surprised if some guys were not buying drugs down at Bung Tau when they went on leave, but they wouldn't bring them back, or if they did, they kept their use of them very confined. I don't think we had a drug problem in the battalion in the time I was there, and I went back about 3 years later just to have a look at things from a historical point of view. And by that stage, the American Army was really being rocked by drugs. But on the whole, we were spared it, I think, partly because we didn't have as much money as the Americans, and therefore the drug pushers focused much more on the Americans, and the Americans were much more numerous, more high profile, and so on. And I think also, our social mores were a bit slower to be infected by that culture. I don't think there's much difference now, but in the mid to late 60s there was.
How aware were you and the men of the protest movement back home?
A bit. It had begun to make itself apparent before we left. There was an organisation called Save Our Sons, which turned up and demonstrated outside Holsworthy. This was ostensibly mothers of national servicemen. I'm not sure whether the mothers of any of our national servicemen were involved. I never knew about it if they were. And I began to hear more in letters from my wife, who was teaching at the University of New South Wales, as how campus attitudes were moving, and you heard a bit about it on news broadcasts that you could get on Radio Australia. But I think on the whole we were taken a bit by surprise by the way things had moved while we were away. We didn't understand the full impact of it and where it was heading when we got back. But at least our battalion didn't have much trouble in its march through Sydney, whereas one RAR the previous year had been the target of quite a few protests, including throwing a bucket of blood over the commanding officer as he led the battalion down Martin Place.
Was that protest causing any morale effects in Vietnam on the battalion?
It was too early. No, it probably did later on, but you'd need to talk to people from from other battalions. I'd say, if anything, it caused mild annoyance.
As the year went on, what sort of morale changes did you see in the battalion as it got closer towards being rotated?
Yeah, good question. I'd say we sort of had a crisis point for morale around February of 1967, when we were still a couple of months off going out. Everyone was sort of tired. You're looking forward to being taken out of it all, but you knew you still had a couple of months to go, and there was some serious operation. We took a lot of casualties in February, and part of that could have been due to people thinking too much about going home and not enough about doing their job.
So it can make you more or less careless in some ways.
When people start thinking about home, it does take your mind off the job, and there's also a tendency to think that you're immortal, that you've survived 8 or 10 months in operations and you'll survive the rest. You don't have to worry. And of course, That's when people found out they did have to worry.
What about the opposite attitude of, God, I've survived this far, I don't want anything to happen to me in the last 2 months, I'm not going to do anything?
Yes, that's a symptom that some show too, but they had to get out and do it for the sake of everyone else. So, but it was a force that was exerted.
There are no old, bold soldiers.
No, not many anyway.
What was the scene in Saigon in those days?
Turbulent. A lot of people around, a lot in uniform. The noise, bustle, huge number of people on motorbikes, everything available in the shops, amazing quality restaurants that, it was just unreal, to step in out of the provinces and see all this going on. But it was fun to take part in for short periods. I wouldn't have wanted to have spent my war in Saigon. I think it would have been very corrupting. But and of course, this is where most journalists were, and they had a very, very partial view of what was happening. Perhaps after lunch we should spend a few minutes talking about reportage.
Oh, yeah, I was going to start that anyway. But when you did go to Saigon, how did you get there?
Usually by a C-130 or a Caribou. The RAAF ran regular courier flights from Vung Tau to Saigon, and we would go down to the Vung Tau airfield by Land Rover and then catch the courier to Tan Son Nhut, and then you were handled by the 8th Aerial Port Battalion that the Americans ran the place with, and then you would have a ticket for what was a BOQ, a Bachelor Officers' Quarters. That's where your overnight accommodation was, and I'd go with someone else from the battalion, someone that I had some rapport with, and we'd go and find a decent restaurant or some interesting places to just stroll around.
Did you have any interest in Vietnamese history and culture?
Yes, I did, but it wasn't well developed. But it was interesting. Sometimes when we captured some Viet Cong documents, there would be poems amongst them, and I would give these to one of my translators to work out what it was about. You became aware very quickly that this was a very literary culture, and people used it as a way of supporting themselves in all kinds of desperate circumstances. I got interested in the various types of Buddhist temple, and there were some quite fine ones in Phuoc Tuy, one on Long Son Island and one up on Nui Dat in particular. The Catholic Buddhist split and all that, and the impact of the French on the place. There were some fine French colonial buildings like the old General Post Office in Saigon, and they had a small cathedral there. They had an opera house. The Cercle Sportif was still going, and so on. And of course you had to understand a bit about the history of groups like the Bin Sun, the river pirates, who operated in the Rung Sat. They were not Viet Cong, but they were not friendly either. They ran their own little empire, and the Hoa Hao up in Tay Ninh province, that's where their temple was, and the Cao Dai, they had their own pope.
Real melting pot there.
Oh, it was. It was just wonderfully complex, but you never got to the bottom of it in the course of a year.
Do you think sufficient attempt was made to understand those subcategories?
No, I don't. And with hindsight, this was a serious fault, because it meant that we didn't understand enough about how to put together some kind of acceptable government in Saigon. It's naive to think you could actually run a democracy in any rigorous sense of the term there, but to give power really to the hands of the military and ignore all these other groups or treat them as hostiles, was undermining the whole process.
Trying to build a democracy out of a country with lots of different power groups in it.
We're still at it, yes.
Professor, if you could just tell us what you gleaned of the VC leadership style from intelligence that you gathered over Vietnam.
Well, it varied according to the type of unit that you're dealing with. We had local guerrilla forces which tended to be pretty loosely organised and didn't have much of a command structure. They were essentially peasants who knew each other, and they had a very casual way of relating to each other, as you would expect. Then you had provincial mobile forces who operated across Phuoc Tuy province. They had somewhat of a more formal structure, but these were people who were still essentially civilians for most of the time, and they would come together for some operations. And then you'd have the Viet Cong regulars, like 274, 275 Regiment and the North Vietnamese, and they had a pretty formal command structure which worked very much like our command structure did, and it had to control logistics and infantry and artillery and intelligence and do all these things in a pretty ordered and systematic way. I have to say that I thought on the whole their command structures worked very well, and they were durable, they could withstand stress, they were adequate for controlling troops when there was a lot of danger around. They were a pretty capable lot.
Can you give us an idea of how the command structure worked within the Viet Cong?
Well, short answer is I can't, because I wasn't ever actually sort of in there with them when they were in battle, so I don't know exactly how they transmitted orders or how they related to each other or how they punished shortcomings and so on. They did. We know about that from interrogation. But all I can say is that down to provincial mobile level, they were pretty well trained. They certainly had a good level of experience. Most of them had been in action for some years. In the case of 274 and 275 Regiment, they would have had several years of operational experience, so they were pretty capable.
Do you know what you'd learned from the Viet Cong defectors? What kind of information did they pass to you?
Yeah. Who was who in the structure, who the regimental and battalion commanders were, where they came from, what kind of family backgrounds they came from, what the internal cohesion of their battalions, regiments was like, what their logistic situation was, how well they were fed and supplied, what their weapons were, what they had done in the past few months, and what they thought of our operations, how effective we had been, what gave them problems, what didn't bother them, those sorts of issues. Quite often these people who defected came as a result of some personal crisis. They were not getting on well with their section commander or platoon commander, or there was a family problem at home and they wanted to be out of their service and back to deal with it. Or in some cases they thought they were on the losing side and that this was all pointless, and therefore they wanted to be released from it. They had a pretty tough system of discipline. I mean, when people did commit misdemeanours, they were physically punished, or they could be tied up for a while. Or if they, did something which their commanders thought was really bad, they could suffer the death penalty.
And What about so the methods of extracting information from, obviously the defectors were giving it willingly, but the Viet Cong that you may have captured, was there a torture process used, or how did they get the information from?
Well, not as the method I used was just to try and sit down and talk to them the way you and I are talking to each other today. I mean, I was not a professionally trained intelligence person, but on the other hand, I had a lot of experience in getting information from people by talking, and so that's the way I went about it. And on the whole, I think people tell you things because they want to, not because they have to. And what you get from people in situations of duress is often what they want you to hear, not necessarily the truth. But there were incidents that we found out about later on at task force headquarters where pressure was applied. You probably heard about the water torture episode of, I think it was late 67 or 68, that the then Minister for the Army, Philip Lynch, got into a lot of trouble over because he said to the press, "There is not one scintilla of evidence that this happened," and yes, there was, Minister. But I have apprehensions about what happened to some of these people once they got back into South Vietnamese hands. I think some of them were abused.
Were you able to sort of learn anything from the Viet Cong that you could then apply to the way the Australian Army was managed to run in Vietnam?
I think the answer to that is not much, because I think we already knew their basic order of battle and how they operated. The information that we got from them had more to do with the political side of the war and how they were standing up to the stresses being applied to them. You could get some feeling, as I said earlier, of the efficiency of our operational methods, but quite often you didn't need the Viet Cong to tell you, you knew. So I don't think interrogation had much use from that perspective, but it was very helpful in terms of finding out where Viet Cong bases were, where their supply routes were, what parts of the province they drew support from.
And what kinds of, where were they getting their support from? Did there tend to be a theme as far as that was concerned?
Yeah, well, they tended to get more support from big villages in the central area, and that of course was what they concentrated on because that was where most of the food was produced. But they also had taxation points on a lot of the minor roads in the province, and peasants coming in to sell their produce at some of the central markets would have to pay 5 or 10%. In one case it got up as high as 40%. To the Viet Cong to be allowed to go through. They would come into villages at night, and they would sometimes conscript people as porters carrying rice from one part of the province to another, or they would proselytise, they would conduct recruiting drives in villages at night. They were a strong presence around whenever we weren't there, and of course we could only be there a relatively small percent of the time in such a big province.
You mentioned that you were sometimes surprised that you weren't attacked by the Viet Cong at your most vulnerable, for instance, maybe when it was pouring with rain. Or,
yes.
What are your reflections on that now? Why do you think they didn't attack you at your most vulnerable?
Mainly because they just weren't prepared to do so. If they could have, they would have. But they had their own major logistic problems, and their manpower was under stress. They were not constantly following us, so they didn't necessarily know where our points of vulnerability were at particular times. But they were at their best when they took the initiative and created an incident which would draw an American or Australian response, which they could then ambush or get caught in booby traps. And we discovered that fairly early in the piece, and so we were pretty cautious in the way in which we reacted, but that was often not the case with the Americans.
As far as access to intelligence material or research material that you needed as an intelligence officer, say at Nui Dat, were you given carte blanche to the materials on the base, or where?
No, no, I wasn't. There was a certain amount that I could get access to that related directly to our own battalion's operations in the next couple of weeks, but there was a lot of material kept in the task force headquarters to which I had no access, and for purposes of secrecy had to be kept to as few people as possible. One thing which bugged me from time to time was that I had very limited access to signals intelligence, and you quite often didn't know whether the information you were getting was really good based on signals information at a high level, or whether it was just some third-rate gossip that someone else had heard in a village and passed on to you. But they're the sort of frustrations you find in working with a military security system. As I said earlier, I was able to shortcut through the maze by going up to the American headquarters at Long Bin and finding out more there.
Were you the only intelligence officer to go up to the American headquarters and
No, I
see
wasn't.
that?
The task force intelligence officer, Alec Piper, used to go up, and I think he was slightly peeved by my cheek in going up there as a battalion intelligence officer, but he didn't stop me. And I used to share information with him. He possibly felt it was useful too.
What about the SAS? Did you have any involvement with them, contact during your career?
Yes, they did some very useful long-range patrolling, and I was able to debrief them a little, find out what they had discovered on their missions. But the SAS, for the most part, were controlled by task force headquarters, and so they didn't need to report directly to us. It was only when we were going to operate in an area where they happened to have been recently that we had this interface. We did also sort of commit to them responsibility for a big area in the Nui Dat range after we had cleared it of Viet Cong in October of 1966, and they used to go back in there and check on it from time to time and see if it was being reused.
When you say you cleared the area of Viet Cong, were you involved in that?
Yeah, that was one of our major battalion operations, and it's a full chapter in Vietnam Task.
Okay, well that probably brings us to a good point. Just perhaps the best way to get down which operations you were involved in, and just a brief summary of your personal involvements of those, starting when you arrived in Vietnam to over the 12 months. For people who are watching this in 100 years,
right? Well,
and haven't read your book.
Our first operation was Operation Hardihood, and the objective of that was to clear the central part of the province, preparatory to setting up the task force base. And for that operation, I was second in command of B Company, and my responsibilities were chiefly to be the rear link man for the company, organising the flow of supplies, casualty evacuation, ammunition, information, that kind of thing. And I also did that in Operation Sydney 1, which was the cordon and search of Duc Me. And after then I was Battalion Intelligence Officer, and I was the first big operation I was involved in was the cordon and search of Bin Ba, and then we had quite a few operations on the northeastern and northwestern perimeter of our area of operations in Phuoc Tuy, because there had been Viet Cong activity there, and we were trying to push them back or interdict their supply routes. And it was while we were on one of those operations that D Company of 6 RAR were ambushed out at Long Tan. This is on the 18th of August 1966, where the Battle of Long Tan occurred, and then we came back into the task force base ready to provide assistance to 6 RAR if they had got into more trouble. Then in October we worked to clear the Viet Cong off the sides of Route 15, which is the main highway connecting Vung Tau and Saigon. The Americans were developing Vung Tau as an alternate port for Saigon, because to get to Saigon, ships had to wind their way up the narrow river that went through this area of mangrove swamps called the Rung Sat. And they were bringing in a new brigade of troops, I think it was the 3rd Brigade of the 4th Division, in early October, and they thought it would solve a lot of port congestion problems if they were offloaded at Vung Tau and then sent by road up to Bien Hoa. Well, to do that, we had to take the road out of Viet Cong control, and there was a range of mountains on the northeastern side of the road that we called the Nui Dat. Nui Dat means Ti Vai Mountain was the highest point there. It was 1,500 or 1,600 feet above the plain, and in going into that area we got involved in our biggest encounters in the war. It was quite hard fighting. There were a lot of caves up in the mountains that the Viet Cong had developed into bases. The caves were interconnected. There was also a long rockfall down one side of the mountain, and there were plenty of passages that the Viet Cong could use under the rocks. And if you're out on top of the rocks, you were exposed to view and therefore to fire. And we got ourselves into a very sticky situation climbing the mountain with the Viet Cong in the caves and under the rocks being able to fire at us, and we couldn't even see them, let alone return the fire and suppress it. And that was an action that went on for a few days, and we had quite a few people killed, and a couple of our platoon commanders won the Military Cross at the same time. It was quite a notable action. Then, well, we did about 3 operations in that area in conjunction with the passage of the American brigade through, and then because we had got to know the Viet Cong infrastructure in that area, we found out a little bit more about the use they were making of an offshore island called Long Son, and our next operation was over there in November. And then in December we focused more on securing the area immediately around Nui Dat. There were a lot of fairly short-range company operations, but nothing really big involving the battalion as a whole. And then in the new year, having done this reassessment of our operational methods, we decided to focus much more on getting the Viet Cong infrastructure out of the central populated area. And we did quite a number of village cordons and searches just in the central part of the province. And then in February, we had to clear some Viet Cong out of another range of hills in the southeastern part of the province, and that was quite a difficult operation. And again, we took quite a number of casualties there. During this time, we had made contact with the isolated headquarters out at Xuan Moc on the eastern side of the province, and once we had some spare capacity, we reopened the road, re-established control over the road there so that they could have free access to the markets in central Phuc Tuy. And as we were doing that, someone in Task Force headquarters had the unfortunate idea that the best way to secure the eastern approaches to the central Phuc Tuy would be to lay a big minefield down the eastern side our area of operations. And the South Vietnamese Army had offered to keep it secure so that the Viet Cong couldn't lift the mines, and the result was we spent a lot of time in March and early April, and other battalions coming in afterwards probably put in several months of work on laying this minefield, fencing it in, and of course the way wars go, Murphy's Law applied. The South Vietnamese Army was under pressure. It couldn't provide the perimeter security for the minefield. The Viet Cong used to get in there at night, lift the mines, and they turned up in booby traps all over Phuoc Tuy and in other parts of South Vietnam. It was a disaster. But anyway, we had left by that stage.
You mentioned that there was a lot more casualties
Yes.
towards the end. I mean, was this part of the reason that there was more casualties?
Yes, I think so, but it's hard to really give you solid justification for that. It's more an impression that I have. I don't think the operations we were doing were as intrinsically as dangerous as some of the earlier ones, but anyway, for one reason or another, people stepped on mines where they didn't step on them earlier, or were blown up by booby traps, and it was a very nasty time.
You were part of a mobile command unit at some...
We were foot mobile for the most part, but we used to sometimes get into armoured personnel carriers and go from area to area, and I myself used to do quite a bit of reconnaissance by helicopter.
Can you talk about your experiences doing that reconnaissance work?
That was great fun, because, as I said earlier, Phuoc Tuy province was very beautiful, and once you got to know its physical structure, you could tell where you were with fair precision, and also with familiarity you could tell whether the Viet Cong were making much use of certain tracks that you could see, because they were the only people out in the remote parts of the province. And it was just very nice to be up there at 3,000 feet by yourself, just with the pilot, because you had to be above 3,000 feet on a reconnaissance mission. If you were much below that, you could be shot at. If you're doing an assault mission, you might come in at very low level fast, but that was not what I was about then. And it was interesting making the sort of judgments and deductions that you have to with your eye and your brain and a notepad on your knee, and gather information to try and give the commanding officer a fuller picture of just what the Viet Cong are doing out there. And of course, it was not easy because the Viet Cong were adept at camouflage. You very rarely saw them unless you caught them really unprepared.
What about mateship? Can you talk about that?
Oh yes,
in Vietnam, and your the real great friendships that you personally made.
Yeah, well, it's quite remarkable. You get dumped down in a strange country with a bunch of people that you don't know very much about, and it takes a little while for friendships to work out, but they usually do. And in my case, it certainly did. And I was very lucky, I think, to be taken onto battalion headquarters, because that was a concentration of very interesting people. And although John War is dead, the rest of us are still alive, and we're in. One of the great things about email is that you can be in contact. And I think it was more a chance of being able to sort of separate ourselves from the army environment and the operational environment, and relax and talk about other things in our lives, things that we were interested in doing, things we wanted still to do that we were going to do, or being able to get out of what we were talking about constantly, and discuss books or places we'd been to, or events or music or something like that. We did have access to the American PX system. PX stands for Post Exchange, and it's the equivalent of our canteen system. But as befits America, they are phenomenally well stocked. And it wasn't long before we were going off and buying nice tape recorders, and you could get beautiful tracks. You couldn't, this was pre-cassettes, it was reel-to-reel tape, and also you could get wonderful extended play discs and so on. So, you know, when we had a little time, which wasn't often, you know, you could put on some really lovely music.
And what music were you listening to there?
It was a combination of, I suppose, chamber music, light classical, pop, rock, and, you know, a bit of light folk and that kind of thing. But and once I had a nice little tape player myself, Sally used to record things for me from home and mail them up to me. So I used to do tapes like we're doing today, all on sound, of course, and send them back to her and give her the sound of my voice and a bit more detailed comment than you could put in a letter on what was going on.
How important was having Sally in Australia and that strong connection that you obviously had helped getting through that whole Vietnam process?
Phenomenally important. I mean, I don't know how I would have done it otherwise, because, you know, she was constantly in my mind. I knew I had her support. I would get a good letter from her every 3 or 4 days. I was doing my book and sending it back to her with letters. You know, it was a very important part of the experience.
Did you observe other gentlemen in the army and think that if they had that kind of contact that they may have been a bit better prepared?
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment. And of course, a lot of the people that I knew best had that sort of supportive relationship with a wife or a fiancée or a girlfriend in Australia. Yeah, it was extremely important.
What about your friendships when you're actually in op, like actually working together when you're on an operation? How did that work for you?
Yeah, well, it was very, very functionally driven. I mean, you related to people that you had to get control of a situation or stave off a threat. So friendship didn't actually enter into it a great deal, but you knew that there were certain people that you had a close personal relationship with who would just understand you a lot better because you were sort of more attuned to each other, and it was always much easier to work with someone like that, particularly over a radio command net when all you've got is the voice. And sometimes you can get a bit of tone into it, but military command circuits are not very hi-fi, so you have to be pretty good at it to convey much tone. Max Carroll, our first ops officer, was supremely good at that. I mean, he could get more out of people on a command net than most other people I have heard. And we all learnt a lot from him that way, I think. But just coming back to the impact of personal relations on operations, you know, it did come into to bear much more when you had a quiet time. You know, when there was a lull and you knew you were going to be staying in an area for a few hours. So, you know, you would get together with someone that you knew you could have an interesting conversation with and chat away.
And what were those conversations about home, or were they about the situation there and then? Those situations?
On the whole, they were not about the immediate situation. I mean, sometimes they had to be, but you know, if nothing was happening, you know, you didn't talk about nothing. So you talked about, you know, things you'd heard on the radio or mutual friends or, you know, some common experience we'd had at an earlier stage.
What about your relationship with the Batman?
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. I was very lucky. I had three excellent batmen. The first one, when I was in B Company, was Norm Crane. Norm was a regular. You know, he'd had quite a bit of service. He was an old hand. He really knew how to look after me and was a bit smarter than I was in a few instances. And then when I was IO, my batman was a guy by the name of Brown, who was also a regular, tall, fairly thin, very perceptive, quite a good cook when we were out in the field, and so on. And the third one, a bit later on, was Mick Iredale. Mick, I think, was a national serviceman from memory. Anyway, they were good to work with, and you know, I think they preferred being batman to being a rifleman out in a platoon for a while. I mean, none of them wanted to be a batman forever, but it was interesting for them to see a bit of battalion headquarters life, and you know, they knew that I was under pressure, and if I was taking time to cook my own meals and boil my billy for tea and so on, there would be a lot of things that the battalion needed that didn't get done, and so on. But you mean, you didn't have a batman at your personal service 24 hours a day. They did have other responsibilities to do. They had to stand sentry duty. At night they had to prepare defences and put up shelters and do their share of lumping supplies and ammunition and so on. But it was a very important part of the war, and I'm glad you raised it, because batmen often just get completely forgotten. And you need to have a batman that you can relate to fairly well personally. Otherwise, you know, tensions.
Do you get a choice in that?
I suppose yes. You don't get a choice in the sense that 12 people are lined up and you know you can pick who you want. You come into a job and there is a batman, and you know you find out from the previous occupant of the job what the batman was like, and if he says, well, you know, get rid of this guy at the first opportunity, that's a warning. But I didn't have that situation, and I'm just trying to remember how Brownie phased out and how Mick Iredale phased in, and I've lost that. Whether Brownie fell ill, or maybe his company just reclaimed him and said it's time he came back to us, I don't know. And I can't remember choosing Iredale. Someone chose him for me, but he was a good choice, not a problem.
You had a couple of visits from some very important Australian politicians while you were in Vietnam.
Yes.
Tell us about those visits.
Well, they contrasted quite a lot. Not all that long after we had arrived. I suppose we'd been there about 3 months. We had a visit from Malcolm Fraser, who was Minister for the Army. Malcolm was very young then, I think in his mid-30s. And we had an acute supply crisis at that time, because the Australian logistics system had just not kicked in at that point. And I can remember our commanding officer saying, good that the minister's coming, I'll be able to tell him our problems and get some ministerial attention on this. Well, when Malcolm came to the battalion area, I mean, he's not a very chummy man, and John Waugh began telling him about our difficulties, and Fraser just cut him off and said, don't tell me your problems, you've got a chain of command to deal with that. I'm here to study the war from my perspective. And you know, so he did what he wanted, and we got no sympathy or support from him as far as we could tell. Yet a few months later, the Defence Minister, Alan Fairhall, came up, and Fairhall had a very different personality. You know, he was not detached and high and mighty in the way that Malcolm Fraser was at that stage. And he asked if we had any problems, and of course John Waugh told him, and you know, Fairhall took out his notebook and began making notes and said, right, well, we'll get these fixed when I get back. And I think he did do something to improve the situation.
Reportage. Vietnam War.
Right. Yeah, this is a very interesting chapter, because I was the Battalion Intelligence Officer, I also had responsibility for looking after journalists when they came with us on operations, and I also had some responsibility for civil liaison. I was the Battalion Civil Affairs Officer. They all went with the portfolio. And we got a great variety of reporters. Some, you could tell, had really just come up to to write sensational accounts. You know, these are on the whole tabloid journalists, and we had one who was with us not long after we arrived, who used to write all this hair-raising stuff as if we were about to be overrun every night. And I can remember one headline, it was "A Night in the Doctor's Weapon Pit," and it was full of all kinds of fanciful stuff. The sad thing about this was that it frightened our wives and girlfriends back home rather needlessly and sensationalised the war. I mean, this chap, I think, was basically supportive of the war and fairly conservative, and he was really trying to show what a good job we're doing and how tough it was. But the trouble was, it just wasn't terribly credible. Then you had other people who came up, who really were looking for points of criticism, and they were quite a challenge. You could tell very early in the piece when you had someone like this, and I mean, my approach to them was to try and match their argument a bit and explain why we were doing certain things and why we did them the way we did, and what sort of results we hoped to achieve and what we had achieved in past operations. So you wouldn't necessarily, not trying to destroy their perspective, but give them a bit more factual fodder to bite on and incorporate in their articles, and perhaps get them to approach reportage of our actions in a somewhat more serious, reasoned way than they might have done otherwise. And I think I had a bit of success.
What kind of preconceptions were they coming with?
That we were killing large numbers of South Vietnamese civilians, that there was a lot of destruction of civil property going on, the sorts of things that were happening in other parts of Vietnam that had begun to get the American operations a bad name. And you could convince them on the whole that things were a bit different, and that there are other approaches to the war. So that was interesting. The Australian correspondent of the London Times, Stuart Harris, came up and spent a bit of time with us, and he just was a very interesting person. I got to know him in a personal sense, and I later spent a bit of time on a friendly basis with him in Canberra after the war. We had very interesting Newsweek correspondent, whose first name, Francois Sully. He died, I think, in the 80s, but he made a huge reputation as a journalist. And he was good because, although he was critical of a lot of American operations, he'd been around wars long enough to see that we were different, and did quite an interesting Newsweek article on us, which I thought was a pretty fair comparison.
What slant did he take in that article?
I think he was saying that we had a different approach and that it worked.
How difficult, I mean, given that your views on the Vietnam were changing during your time there, how challenging was it to you to keep telling these journalists that were asking sometimes disparaging questions about the war?
Yeah.
And did you have to keep face, or did you just tell them what you were thinking as your thinking was changing?
I know I didn't tell them everything I was thinking, but I did try. Well, first of all, try not to tell them anything that was wrong or misleading, and second, reality is always such a complex business, to throw in a whole lot of stuff so that they could take their pick. Really, I mean, I wasn't trying to say that everything was going fine, but I wasn't saying it was all going to hell in a handcart either, and they could sort of make their own selection of it. There was a guy, his first name was Russ, will come back to me in a bit. He was writing a book about the Vietnam War, and it was published later on. It was titled Happy Hunting Ground. He had been a US Marine in the Korean War and had written a very good book on his experiences as a Marine. I think it was called The Last Parallel. Anyway, he wrote this book about Vietnam. We could tell it was going to be a pretty critical book, but he had a chapter on his experiences with the Australians in there, and he had a few lines on me there, if I remember them correctly. He said, yeah, he met this guy who had been a Rhodes Scholar, a tall, slender guy with a face like a priest. What's he doing in the gookin business?
You talk about how you would gain intelligence from Vietnamese people. What efforts did you make to dig intelligence from your own people, your own troops?
Yeah, well, the amount of information that you could get back from them was pretty limited because it depended upon what they saw and heard during an operation. But sometimes, if they were, particularly when they were out on patrols, lying up quietly in the jungle, they could discover some useful things. And there was an intelligence section representative with each of the companies, and they would gather things immediately and let me know. And then if need be, I would go down to the company and talk to them, or someone from the company would come and talk to me. But it was on the whole fairly short range, immediate stuff.
Did you suffer from the age-old military tradition that military intelligence is a bit of a contradiction in the way that the men dealt with you?
Yeah, no, on the whole, because we were working with fairly pragmatic people who knew enough about the military system not to take it totally seriously, and again, the practical consideration was that we all depended upon each other for our lives, and so you didn't make things unduly difficult for the system to work. And it was up to me to try and get as clear a picture as I could in my own mind of what the enemy intended over the next couple of weeks, and it behoved them to let me do it. It worked pretty well.
During your time as Battalion IO, what major coups did you and the battalion have in the war?
Well, I think the most important one was up on Nui Dat, and you really need to read Vietnam Task to understand that. But we cleared a formed Viet Cong defensive position out, had a lot of people in it. It was potentially very dangerous. To us, it gave the Viet Cong control over a substantial stretch of Route 15, which meant they could close off an important strategic axis between Vung Tau and Saigon. And during that operation, we also captured the diary and some marked up maps that belonged to the deputy commander of 274 Regiment, Nguyen Nam Hung. And that was the big intelligence coup of the war, because his diary, when translated, enabled us to see exactly where they'd been day by day over the previous 9 months. It gave us some idea of what they thought of us and our effectiveness, what impact our coming into Phuoc Tuy had made on their operations, and it also gave us some idea of what they were thinking about doing. And one of the curious things is that they stayed on track. You know, you'd think after losing some of these documents, they might have scrapped the plans for various attacks and so on, but they didn't, and so we were forewarned.
When you entered that VC complex, did it give you any surprises about how well they were set up?
Yes, I mean they were amazingly cleverly set up. We had this network of caves, and they had dug interconnecting passages between them at the back, well inside the mountain. They had beds in there. They had organised a water supply. They had one marvellous sort of self-concealing passage, which was a pivoted rock which swung on a beam, and you pivoted the rock back one way when you wanted to open up the hole, and once you'd gone through it, you pulled the beam and the rock pivoted back, and when you were above it you couldn't tell that there was a passageway underneath it. They were very good at that kind of thing, and also the amount of radio equipment they had with them was surprising. We captured some of it. It was fairly new Chinese stuff, so its loss to them would have been quite significant too. We also got some complaints from our signals intelligence people because as we had pinched the Viet Cong radio set, there were no longer so many signals for them to listen to. However, they soon made good the deficiency.
It must have been quite an eerie feeling to walk through a complex like that, recently vacated.
Yes, well, I didn't do more than go to the entrance. It was our assault pioneers and the engineer squadron from Task Force who were the professionals at handling tunnel complexes who did it. But yes, they had left the interior of a few of these caves laced with booby traps that were set off with fine threads that were laid in a crisscross fashion across it. John McAloney, who was our assault pioneer platoon commander, got a military cross for the way in which he approached them. He sort of led the way in there personally and removed the first few booby traps.
What a joyous job.
Oh, tough, yeah.
What would you describe, looking back, as your most dangerous time or most dangerous incident?
I think probably on Nui Dat at one stage when the battalion headquarters was climbing up a very steep, narrow path that went up over rocks. We'd sent the anti-tank platoon through to sort of clear the way, and there were a bunch of Viet Cong in there who let the anti-tank platoon go past, thinking perhaps this is just a small patrol. And battalion headquarters is not really brilliantly situated for conducting its own defensive battle. You think you're going to have the battalion around you, and suddenly we found ourselves on the point of the attack. And a couple of people were hit by snipers, including the signals officer Brian Ledan. And I suppose we were all vulnerable, but very few of us were hit. So that was one scary moment. I can remember another one where we were involved in an attack on a Viet Cong position somewhere in the northeast of the province. I think this was probably when I was still B Company second in command, and there was quite a lot of fire flying around. And seeing some of our chaps just get up and charge straight into it, and you felt like saying, "Get out, you fools! You're not bulletproof." And these guys never thought about that. They were aware that someone was firing at them, and particularly when one of their own friends had been wounded, a different sort of reflex takes over, and you're full of adrenaline to go and get that bastard before he kills someone else. So those sorts of things are very vivid. I mean, I can remember being a bit worried before our first operations, about the factor of fear. Was this going to be a problem? And in fact, once you get into an operation and angry people start exchanging shots, all that goes, your instincts for self-preservation take over, and you're very sharply focused on eliminating the opposition. And a couple of those small reconnaissance patrols that I was talking about earlier, they were quite scary too. The worst danger was not being killed but being captured. And I really dreaded that prospect, but unfortunately none of us were, and so you put that to the back of your mind.
What, in your experience in Vietnam, makes a good infantry officer in terms of leadership in battle?
Intelligence in the sense of mental capacity above all. I don't mean intelligence in the sense of information about the enemy. Because a good platoon commander has to be capable of seeing where the threat is, recognising it, and quickly working out in his mind what's the best approach for dealing with it, and then understanding where his own people are, the stresses they're under, and how he's going to communicate his orders and make them comprehensible and doable for his chaps. I mean, if you can do that, you're a very good platoon commander. And I would say basic intelligence is the most important attribute.
Is that more important than courage, in your opinion?
Well, I think I think courage does come second. I think most people are courageous, actually. I think we're programmed that way. I mean, some people, I suppose, are super courageous and will think nothing about risking their lives. Most people think a little bit, but you can think of rationales for putting those doubts to one side. I think there are some people who take foolish risks, and in your own studies of the First and Second World War, some of the notable multiple decoration winners were probably people of that kind, who genuinely did not care whether they lived or died. But those people are very few and far between, and most people, I think, really have what it takes to make a good infantry soldier, provided they're led in an intelligent and understanding way, which does not take their efforts for granted or sort of treat them in an unfair, inhumane way.
How did you personally react under fire? How did you keep yourself going?
Well, I wasn't often under fire. That's one thing. Second, when you are under fire, you want very much to get rid of whoever is firing at you, and so all your instincts are towards eliminating the threat. Running away is not a very good idea, because you get up and expose yourself as a target. It's much better to be down, get into a fire position, or move to somewhere where you can use your weapon, or help other people who can do it better to do so.
As the converse question from that original one, what would you think was your most ludicrous or most humorous moment?
Yeah, well, again, that is related in Vietnam Task. Not long after I became Battalion Intelligence Officer, we were doing a cordon search of Bin Ba, and we had to put the battalion headquarters down in a safe area a bit removed from the village. We chose a cleared area that we could defend easily. What we didn't know was that this was an occasional burial area, and we had just got ourselves set up there, and an old lady in the village died, and the following day her relatives wanted to bury her in the middle of the battalion headquarters position. So this raised an interesting problem. How did you know that there was not a bomb in the coffin? And I can remember saying to Max Carroll that this is clearly an operational matter and he should go and sort it out. And he said, "No, O'Neill, this is a civil affairs matter and you're the civil affairs officer, you fix it." So I then had to go and halt this team of loudly wailing mourners and coffin bearers, get them to put the coffin down, through my interpreter explain to them why we had a problem with them burying this coffin in the middle of battalion headquarters on that afternoon. And fortunately they could see our problem, so they were willing to talk about it. But the only way to resolve the problem was to get them to take the lid off the coffin. And they didn't like doing that, but they did. And it was just a little old lady. They lifted up the feet, they lifted up the head, they lifted up the middle, and I could check that there was no bomb in there. And we put it all back together, and the wailing continued and the procession continued.
And everything went back to normal then?
It did, yes. No explosions occurred.
And at what point was it, again, can you confirm, when you were contacted regarding the possibility of a teaching post?
I think it was in November of 1966. It could have been December, but it was around then.
And your good friends amongst the officer establishment there, what did they think of you doing that?
Well, some of them thought it was quite a natural thing to do. Others thought, oh God, why go and be an academic? You got a fairly full range of reactions, but Colonel Waugh thought, yeah, this would be a good thing for you to do. But he said you won't stay in the army. He was quite sure about that, and he ended up quite right about it. And a lot of them had been through Duntroon themselves, and thought it was on the whole a good idea to upgrade the place.
Can you tell us about how your tour came to be cut slightly short by illness?
Yeah, well, I had vertigo in my last few weeks in Vietnam, which meant I lost my sense of balance for... I probably couldn't walk properly for a week or 10 days. It was quite a nasty attack, and with vertigo you get nausea. It's really not a very pleasant thing at all. Tony White recognised what it was straight away and sent me down to Vung Tau to the hospital. I had about a week in hospital and recovered some capacity to walk, and then got back to the battalion. And by that stage all the detailed instructions for our movement back to Australia were coming through, and a certain number of people had to go by air. And Tony said, well, 12 days on a pitching aircraft carrier is not what you need at this point. So he made sure I got on a plane. I came back on a C-130.
And what sort of medical facilities were you in Vietnam then? Can you describe the care you were given?
It was the 8th Field Ambulance. By that stage they had some galvanised iron huts down at Vung Tau, which had, I think, concrete floors. They were certainly hard floors. They were fairly basic army beds, but that was all right. And I didn't need much treatment other than rest. I was on a drug, I think it was Stemetil. I have had vertigo since then, and it is Stemetil that I use now. Whether it was Stemetil then, I'm not quite sure. But anyway, whatever it was, it suppressed the nausea and helped me get back on my feet. And I was able to do a bit of reading. That was all right.
And how did it feel to be in Vietnam one day and back in Australia the next?
Felt really good because this was a day that we'd all been looking for a long time. It was just wonderful to be back with Sally and to have the next phase of life moving along in a much more materially comfortable way, not having to deal with the problems of Vietnam every day.
I should have asked you, how did you come to be awarded a mention in dispatches?
That was due to the goodness of Colonel John Waugh. He had the capacity to write citations for people he thought really deserving of them, and he did several. I think Max Carroll had an MID, and I think Tony White did too. Yes, I came across the citation for mine the other day. It refers to excellence of intelligence work over the course of the battalion's tour there, and something about leadership.
What sort of troubles did you have settling into life in Australia after a year in the bush, as it were?
Yeah. Well, things are a little bit sort of boring and mundane, when you get back in your own apartment, and it's all very confined and so on. So you tend to feel a little bit at a loose end sometimes. But I had the book to finish off. I mean, although I had a kind of first draft there, it needed a lot of stitching together and editing and so on. So although I had leave for about 4 or 5 weeks, I spent most of that time working on the book and getting it into shape to go to the publisher, and of course spending time with the publishers, and then beginning the process of getting the Army to approve it. Just trying to think of, I really don't think there were all that many problems, because it was just so nice to be home in so many ways. A lot of people wanting to talk about the war. I suppose I got a bit bored with that after a while.
Were you faced with did you kill anyone sort of questions from people?
Not really, no. The people I talked to on the whole were fairly nice, intelligent people.
Did you bring home any of that jumpiness, paranoia, stress-related condition from Vietnam?
I don't think so, but Sally would be a better person to ask than me. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if I was a bit jumpy, but it didn't. The relief of being home was what I focused on. But I could well have been a bit jumpy. I don't know. But one thing, I've never had bad dreams about Vietnam. I don't think I've ever. I may have had a couple of dreams about it, but they weren't terrifying ones, and it was a long time ago.
If, as a hypothetical question, if you were just to say to somebody, "Hi, I'm Robert. I'm a Vietnam veteran," what do you think would go through their mind about you? What's your view of that cliche?
What kind of psychological wreck is this? No, I'm afraid vets have got a bad image, and that's partly due to the antics of a minority of people, and partly due, I think, to the translation of a lot of the American Vietnam veteran syndrome into our own society. I mean, quite a lot of people do sort of suddenly find out that I, as an academic, served in the Vietnam War, and it's a matter of great surprise, how this could come about, and they might ask a question or two, or they might not. Quite often they don't. It's beyond their comprehension. They hadn't come prepared for this situation. And because I've spent a lot of my life in the international environment, if this comes up, and a huge number of people say, "How? But you're not an American. How could you have been in Vietnam?" Relatively few Americans know that we were in the Vietnam War, let alone other people.
Having served in an infantry battalion at the sharp end, as it were, what do you think that gave you for the rest of your career?
Well, it gave me an understanding of what it's like to be in combat, and as wars do play a big role in in the course of human history, it gives you a much sharper insight into war as a phenomenon and to why wars often work out the way they do. There are not a lot of other people in the military history business these days who have been in a war, so it gave me a huge professional advantage like that, which I've never sought to play on in any negative sense against my military historical contemporaries, but it's certainly there, and I think it's always strengthened my credibility in teaching and writing in this field.
Does it strengthen your understanding of sometimes dry historic fact?
Yeah, it does, because you can think your way into the minds, of the soldiers who were taking part, and you think, how long was it since they had a decent meal? How much sleep did they have the night before? Were they soaking wet this morning? That kind of thing. How are they relating with their command system? What are they being told about the enemy?
Sometimes when you read historical accounts written by modern historians and they say, the such and such a company really failed to move to that objective quick enough, you must think of it sometimes in a different way about what was going on.
Much more complex than that, yeah.
So tell us about integrating yourself into Royal Military College when you got back.
Yeah, well, that wasn't so difficult because there I was as a member of the faculty, and I had an interesting bunch of academic colleagues around. Alec Hill, who was in charge of the history department at that stage, a distinguished military historian who had taught history at Sydney Grammar School and went on to write a fine biography of Harry Chevelle. Len Turner came in as the first professor of history. He was a South African, with a photographic memory and a huge experience of writing on wars. And there were people in other departments who were interesting to relate to. I mean, Duntroon was a bit frustrating because it was so small, and its library facilities at that point were poorly developed. A lot of people in the University of New South Wales thought it was a bad idea suddenly to be taking on responsibility for the Army's academic training, with the war in Vietnam and so on. We began to experience a lot of that backwash in the relationship. But the main thing really was relating to the cadets and trying to prepare these guys to face what I had to face, because they were all going to be platoon commanders in a year or two and so on. And those cadets included Peter Cosgrove. And
do you recall him personally?
Yes, I do.
What was he like as a cadet?
Yeah, he was good. He was not what I would call academically gifted, but he was certainly bright, a good participant, and quick. His mind had a very quick brain. And there were other people like General Peter Abigail. And Peter didn't rise to the same heights as Peter Cosgrove, but was very bright, impressive guy. David Horner, who's written a lot of Australian military history, was a cadet then. Alan DuPont, who's now a senior fellow at the Lowy Institute for International Policy. They were a bright lot.
Okay, Professor, we'll get you to your taxi in a moment. I just wondered if there was any, for the record, for the future, for posterity, any message you wanted to leave behind, particularly about service or Australia's military history, in a nutshell?
I think I've probably said it at length. The things that occur to me now at the end of this interview are, that it's very easy to apply force counterproductively in the international society. It does need to be applied from time to time, and it can be applied selectively and with beneficial results. But we've got to think very hard about how we do it. and understand the fragility of the international system.
Thanks, Professor.
My pleasure.